large human skulls, and skeletons that measured between 7 and 8 feet in height.
To find such an intact brain inside a perfectly preserved skull.
In 1982, deep in a Florida swamp, archaeologists uncovered a skull that should have been nothing more than brittle bone. Instead, inside it was a preserved brain, still recognizable after 8,000 years.
Is not unique. Elongated skulls have been found all over the world. Their DNA was tested and the results were surprising.
When scientists tested its DNA, the results shook them to the core. This is why the discovery of one skull has left experts terrified and questioning everything we thought we knew about human history. The accidental discovery. The summer sun in Florida is unforgiving. In 1982, the town of Titusville buzzed with activity as a new housing development, Windover Farms, began taking shape. Heavy machinery carved into the earth, preparing to create retention ponds and roads for future homes. To the workers, it was just another day of construction. No one expected history to rise from the soil that morning. One of the operators, a man named Steve Vanderjocht, guided his backhoe across a section of damp, peaty ground. The plan was simple: dig out a shallow basin for rainwater runoff. But as his machine clawed into the dark earth, it jolted to a stop. He assumed he had struck a buried rock, which was already unusual in Florida's soft ground. Curious, he climbed down from his cab to investigate. Kneeling beside the hole, Steve pulled something from the mud. In his hands rested a human skull, stained brown and damp from centuries underground. At first glance, it looked like the aftermath of a crime. The discovery stunned him. He later recalled feeling an odd chill despite the heavy heat of the day. It was as though he had disturbed something meant to remain hidden. Steve quickly alerted his supervisor, who in turn contacted local authorities. Within the hour, law enforcement arrived and roped off the site. Officers peered into the pit, where the outline of other bones could already be seen poking through the peat. The sheriff's team suspected a homicide. Titusville had seen its share of disappearances and dark rumors, so no one was shocked by the thought of an old grave. The possibility of mass murder even crossed their minds. The county coroner examined the skull more closely. Something about it was wrong. The texture was soft and crumbly, the color darkened from years of soaking in peat. It lacked the look of fresh remains. The coroner quickly realized this was no recent death. Whatever this was, it had been here far longer than anyone alive could remember. Construction was immediately halted. The developers, to their credit, did not attempt to brush the matter aside. Instead, they contributed money, equipment, and even pumps to help preserve the site and ensure that whatever story lay beneath the swamp would be studied properly. This was not just a legal matter anymore. It was a historical one. Soon, archaeologists were called in to take over the investigation. Among them was Dr. Glenn Doran, a young anthropologist from Florida State University, who would become the central figure in what was about to unfold. At first, Doran thought the site looked unremarkable. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a muddy pond with thick moss and dark water. But once excavation began, his opinion quickly changed. The questions multiplied faster than answers. Why were burials placed in the middle of a swamp? How had the fragile bones survived in Florida's harsh climate, where humidity and heat normally destroy organic material within decades? And if these skulls and bones were so well preserved, what else might be waiting below the peat? The site carried an eerie stillness, as if the bog itself was guarding its secrets. Workers and scientists alike felt the weight of its mystery. They were standing on ground that held people who had lived and died thousands of years earlier. The pond was no crime scene from recent memory, but a cemetery from deep antiquity. The discovery quickly drew attention. Local papers reported on the strange find, and whispers spread through the community. Residents speculated wildly about who the people had been. Were they Native Americans? Could they have been victims of some forgotten catastrophe? Or was the bog hiding something even stranger? For Dr. Doran and his team, the only way forward was patience and precision. Every scoop of soil, every uncovered bone had to be documented. Mistakes could destroy evidence that had been preserved for millennia. The team began preparing for a long and delicate excavation, one that would require methods no one had used in Florida before. What had begun as a simple construction project now stood on the edge of rewriting history. The Windover Pond was no longer just a swamp. It had become a doorway to a world 8,000 years gone, a world whose people left behind more than bones. As the machines withdrew, the swamp grew quiet again. Beneath its peat lay a hidden cemetery, sealed by time, waiting for scientists to uncover its secrets. But when they finally peeled back the layers, they would discover something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Draining the pond and revealing the dead. Once the discovery at Windover Pond shifted from a police investigation to an archaeological project, the real work began. What looked like a muddy retention basin was far more complicated than it seemed. The site was covered by layers of thick peat and stagnant water. In some places, there were 6 feet of water sitting above 10 feet of waterlogged peat. Beneath that, bones and artifacts had rested undisturbed for thousands of years. The challenge was enormous. Traditional excavation tools could not be used without risking damage to fragile remains. Dr. Glenn Doran and his colleague David Dickel knew they had to approach the site differently if they wanted to preserve what lay below. They designed a system that would slowly drain the pond without disturbing the soil structure. Around the edge of the site, they installed more than 150 well points. These pipes allowed water to be drawn out continuously at a rate of nearly 600 gallons per minute. The pumps worked day and night, lowering the water level gradually until the dark peat began to surface. With the water removed, the peat had to be handled with extreme care. It was both a blessing and a challenge. The very reason the remains were preserved so well was because of the peat's unusual chemistry. The bog was low in oxygen and rich in natural acids, which prevented normal decay. This meant soft tissue and delicate structures could survive in ways no one thought possible in Florida's humid climate. Yet, the same peat was also fragile. If handled too roughly or allowed to dry out, the bones inside it could crumble instantly. The excavation team approached the soil like surgeons. Instead of shovels and spades, they used trowels, wooden picks, and even chopsticks to peel away the layers. Spray bottles kept the bones wet so they would not disintegrate when exposed to air. Often, skeletons were left pedestaled, meaning the soil around them was shaved away while the body remained supported in its original position. Every discovery was documented with photographs and drawings before being lifted from the earth. The process was slow and painstaking. It took 3 full field seasons, spread across 1984, 1985, and 1986, to expose only half of the pond. The other half was deliberately left untouched for future archaeologists who might one day have better tools and technology. Even so, the work completed during those 3 seasons revealed more than anyone had imagined possible. During one excavation, a team member noticed something unusual in a skull. Inside was a greasy, tan-colored substance. At first, the crew laughed, joking about what it could be, but when specialists examined it, they realized it was not a trick of the soil. It was human brain tissue, still preserved after thousands of years. The discovery left the team stunned. The joke quickly turned into one of the most important revelations in American archaeology. As the dig continued, more skulls with brain matter were recovered. Some contained only faint traces, while others held tissue that was still recognizable as brain. By the end of the early seasons, 9 skulls had soft matter inside, and 5 had brains so well preserved that their structures were visible. This was something no one thought possible in a region where heat and moisture usually destroy organic remains in a matter of decades. Scientists began sending samples for radiocarbon dating. The results added another layer of wonder. The bones and peat were between 7,700 and 8,300 years old. The people buried here had lived during the Middle Archaic period, long before the pyramids of Egypt were built. These were not recent ancestors, but a community from deep prehistory. At least 40 individuals were identified in the early excavations, ranging from infants to the elderly. Men, women, and children were all present. The sheer diversity suggested that this was not an accidental burial ground or a site of sudden disaster. It had been used repeatedly as a cemetery, carefully chosen and cared for over centuries. The archaeologists had expected to recover bones, but instead they found brains, their folds and shapes still visible after 8,000 years. This impossible discovery forced scientists to ask, how could soft tissue survive for so long? And what secrets did these ancient brains still hold? Secrets in the swamp. By the time the main excavations were finished, the bog had revealed the remains of more than 160 people. Some records list the total closer to 170. But either way, it was clear that this was not a small burial ground. It was a community cemetery used over centuries, where men, women, children, and even infants were carefully laid to rest. The most astonishing discovery was not the number of skeletons, but what was still inside many of their skulls. 91 of them contained preserved brain tissue. Some were little more than shrunken remnants, but others were so well preserved that their surface contours and folds could be seen. Under a microscope, scientists even identified traces of nerve fibers and cellular structures. No one had ever expected such preservation in Florida's hot, damp climate. To hold in their hands a brain that had survived for 8,000 years was almost unthinkable.
This Florida bog holds a startling secret. From its depths emerge over 160 prehistoric skeletons, miraculously preserved.
The presence of so many preserved brains made Windover unique among archaeological sites. In most cases, only hard bones survived the passage of time. At Windover, not only had bone endured, but soft tissue as well. Scientists were able to extract DNA not just from the skeletons, but also from the preserved brains. This allowed for studies that had previously been impossible, giving researchers a direct genetic link to people who had lived thousands of years before. The graves did not only contain bodies, they also held objects that painted a picture of how these people lived. In 37 of the burials, pieces of woven cloth were found. In total, 86 textile fragments were recovered, showing at least 7 different weaving patterns. Some were simple mats or coverings, while others suggested more careful craftsmanship. These textiles are among the oldest woven fabrics ever discovered in the Americas, proof that this community had advanced skills that went beyond survival. Other objects told stories of hunting and daily life. Archaeologists uncovered spear throwers, projectile points, bone needles, and awls that may have been used for sewing or basket making. They found shells, seeds, and even gourds that had been used as containers. Wooden stakes were placed around some bodies, perhaps to anchor them in the soft ground. In other cases, branches and peat were arranged over the remains as though to seal them in place. Everything suggested careful planning and ritual rather than haphazard burial. The positioning of the bodies was another clue to their customs. Many were found in a flexed position, with arms and legs folded inward, lying on their left side and facing west. The consistency of this practice suggested it held meaning for the community, though what that meaning was remains lost to time. These people did not bury their dead randomly. They followed traditions, which meant they also shared beliefs and values. Perhaps the most moving evidence of their humanity came from the bones themselves. One skeleton belonged to a teenage boy who had suffered from spina bifida, a painful condition of the spine. Despite his disability, he had lived for years, long enough to reach adolescence. This meant that others must have cared for him, fed him, and protected him. In a time when survival was hard, this was not something to take for granted. It showed that Windover was more than a group of hunters. It was a community that cared for its weak and honored its dead. The combination of brains, bones, and artifacts created a picture that no single discovery could have painted alone. Here was a society with structure, with rituals, with technology that went beyond simple tools. They wove cloth, they hunted with skill, they tended to the sick, and they buried their loved ones with care. Their cemetery was not a place of fear, but of memory. Yet even as archaeologists pieced together their world, questions grew louder. Who exactly were these people, whose DNA did not quite match any group living today? Genes in the mud, DNA, and origins. Researchers carefully sampled both bones and brain matter. They recovered mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, and in some cases, nuclear DNA, which provides a fuller picture of ancestry. What they found was both expected and startling. The people of Windover carried markers that linked them to ancient populations from Asia, supporting the theory that early Americans had originally migrated across the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. Yet, their genetic story did not match any modern Native American group. This mismatch puzzled scientists. If all Native American populations descended from those first migrations, why did the Windover remains show patterns that did not continue into the present? Was this simply a rare variation within a broader genetic pool, or had an entire lineage disappeared from history? The answer was not clear, but it opened new questions about the complexity of human movement and survival in ancient North America. Some genetic clues suggested that family relationships were present within the burial ground. One allele, a small variation in a DNA sequence, was found in several individuals. This indicated kinship and reinforced the idea that Windover was not a one-time mass burial, but a cemetery used by a community over generations.
Families had returned to the same pond again and again to bury their loved ones, turning the site into a sacred place of memory. The radiocarbon dates confirmed the depth of this history. The remains ranged from about 7,800 to 8,300 years old, placing them firmly in the Middle Archaic period. This was long before the rise of agriculture in North America, centuries before complex chiefdoms and cities emerged. Yet these people were not primitive wanderers. They had developed social structures, woven fabrics, cared for the sick, and created traditions that lasted for centuries. The scientific importance of the DNA analysis was enormous. In a landmark paper, Dr. Glenn Doran and his colleagues described how preserved soft tissue had provided intact cellular remnants and usable DNA, making Windover one of the oldest examples in the world where genetic material could be directly studied. For archaeologists and geneticists, it was like peering through a window into a chapter of history that had almost been erased. The implications went far beyond Florida. If the Windover people represented a lineage that left no modern descendants, then human history in the Americas was more fractured than anyone had believed. Populations may have come, thrived for centuries, and vanished without leaving a trace in today's genetic map. The Windover discovery challenged the assumption that early groups simply evolved into later tribes. Instead,
It suggested a more complicated story of migration, isolation, and extinction. When combined with the artifacts and burial practices, the DNA painted a picture of a self-sufficient but unique community. They were connected to ancient migrations, yet stood apart from those who came later. They were part of humanity's larger story, but their specific voice had been silenced long ago. If their DNA tells a story separate from all living tribes, then who were these people, and why did their lineage vanish? Let's now tell you about one extraordinary brain that would offer even more disturbing clues, speaking louder than genes ever could. Brains beyond time. Nearly 90 of the skeletons uncovered at the site held some form of brain tissues. Some were little more than shrunken fragments, but others still displayed the folds and ridges that define human thought. Among all these finds, one stood apart. Archaeologists labeled it Burial 82. Inside this skull, the brain was so well preserved that one scientist described it as beautiful.
Are so complex in shape and size that it's hard to believe that they're the result of any form of cranial deformation or head binding.
Though reduced to perhaps 1/3 of its original size, the organ retained its familiar convolutions, the rippled patterns that once carried memory, language, and emotion. To hold such a relic was like holding a ghost of thought, a glimpse of a mind from 8 millennia ago. Under the microscope, Burial 82 revealed even more. Researchers identified remnants of nerve fibers and traces of cellular structures. This was not just an empty shell, but tissue that still carried the outlines of the complex network that had once governed a living person's body. In that moment, the past became deeply personal. Scientists were no longer studying abstract skeletons. They were peering directly into the preserved brain of an individual who had lived, worked, and died in Florida long before recorded history. The question was how such preservation could be possible. Florida's heat and humidity destroy most organic material in a matter of months. Yet, here were brains that had survived for more than 8,000 years. The explanation lay in the chemistry of the bog. The peat was rich in acids and deprived of oxygen. When the bodies were placed into it, the environment acted like a natural preservative. It halted the usual decay that microbes bring, slowing the breakdown of flesh. Minerals from the surrounding water likely played a role as well, hardening and stabilizing tissue that would otherwise have dissolved. Timing was just as critical as chemistry. The degree of preservation suggested that the dead were buried almost immediately, perhaps within a day or two after death. This quick placement into the bog meant the process of decomposition barely had a chance to begin. Once submerged, the bodies rested in a natural tomb that locked them away from the destructive forces of air and sun. The significance of these preserved brains went beyond simple wonder. For the first time, scientists had the opportunity to compare the structure of ancient brains with those of modern humans. This opened new doors into the study of neurological evolution. Researchers could look for signs of disease, developmental conditions, or features that might have changed over thousands of years. What had once seemed an impossible dream became reality inside a quiet Florida swamp. When the findings were published in scientific journals, the response was electric. The 1986 report in Nature described Windover as one of the oldest known examples of preserved brain tissue with viable DNA. Suddenly, the swamp was no longer just a local curiosity, but a site of international importance. Archaeologists, geneticists, and medical researchers alike turned their attention to Windover, each hoping to extract more secrets from its silent graves. Yet, with every answer came new mysteries. How many other burial sites might have once existed in similar bogs, now lost to time. Were the conditions at Windover unique, or could other communities across the ancient Americas have used similar places to preserve their dead? And what could these preserved brains reveal about the daily lives, the diets, and even the diseases of people who had lived so long ago? But this brain held more than preservation. It carried a genetic mystery that reached beyond science and into the unknown. The woman with the impossible brain. Burial 82 was identified as a woman who had lived nearly 8,000 years ago. The woman was about 45 years old at the time of her death.
Her left ear is visible, and if you look carefully, you can see that there is a little wooden plug sticking through a hole in her earlobe, which would keep the hole open.
Her bones told a story of a long and difficult life. Signs of arthritis marked her spine and hands, proof that she had worked hard and carried heavy loads. Her teeth were worn down from a diet of coarse foods. Marks on her pelvis showed that she had given birth several times, evidence of her role as a mother. Yet, despite the hardships, she had lived longer than many others of her time, suggesting strength, resilience, and perhaps a respected place in her community. What made her most remarkable, however, was not the story told by her bones, but the secret preserved inside her skull. Her brain, though shrunken to a fraction of its original size, retained its folds, membranes, and delicate structures. When scientists looked at it, they could still see the ridges that once carried her thoughts and memories. Under the microscope, the tissue revealed traces of nerve fibers and cell patterns that should have vanished long ago. To the researchers, it was as if her mind had been sealed away, waiting for them to uncover it. The shock deepened when DNA was taken from her brain tissue and bone marrow. Most ancient remains in the Americas fall into 5 well-documented mitochondrial haplogroups, labeled A, B, C, D, and X. These are genetic families that map out the migrations of people from Asia into the New World. But the woman's DNA did not match these known groups. Instead, it revealed a rare marker, an anomalous lineage that did not align neatly with any population recognized in North or South America. At first, scientists wondered if it was an error, but the mystery grew when 2 other individuals from Windover were later found to carry the same unusual marker. They had been buried in different parts of the pond and were not closely related to her or to each other. This ruled out the possibility of a single family trait. What they had uncovered was the footprint of a genetic line that no longer exists. The implications were unsettling. Could there once have been a branch of early Americans who disappeared entirely, leaving no descendants? Was this evidence of a population wiped out by disease, conflict, or changing environments? Or had their genetic traces simply been swallowed up and erased as other groups mingled and spread across the continent? The Windover woman, with her impossible brain, raised questions that challenged the simplest models of human migration. Her brain also showed structural features that caught the attention of scientists. Subtle differences were noticed in its shape. Her frontal lobes appeared slightly larger than expected, and the symmetry between the hemispheres was not quite the same as in modern populations. The differences were not enough to suggest disease, but they hinted at traits that may have belonged to her vanished lineage. Were these natural variations or signs of a genetic heritage that disappeared with her people? No one could say for certain. If even the most intact brain could not connect these people to any living tribe, then their story remains suspended between discovery and mystery. Let's return to the swamp itself, where questions linger like whispers in the water, reminding us that Windover's secrets are far from fully uncovered. What remains unsolved? The Windover site continues to stand as one of the richest archaeological treasures in North America. Its discovery gave scientists a rare look into the lives of people who lived nearly 8,000 years ago. Yet while it answered some questions, it left behind even greater mysteries. Today, researchers see Windover not as the end of a story, but as the beginning of new paths for science. The preserved brains shocked the world because they showed that soft tissue could survive far longer than expected. For the future, this has profound meaning. If tissue can endure in Florida's climate, then other swamps, bogs, or peatlands across the world might also hold secrets. Archaeologists are now expanding their searches, looking to wetlands as potential time capsules of human history. Each bog could contain another Windover, waiting for discovery. DNA from the burials is still being studied with modern tools. When the first genetic tests were done in the 1980s, technology was limited, and many results were incomplete. Today, advanced sequencing can uncover details that were invisible before. Researchers are re-examining Windover DNA, hoping to clarify whether the unusual markers truly belong to a vanished lineage or represent a connection to populations that we have not yet identified. Every new test brings the possibility of rewriting migration maps of the ancient Americas. The unanswered questions about where the Windover people lived also guide future exploration. So far, no permanent settlement has been located near the pond, leaving a gap in the story of their daily lives. Archaeologists believe that new survey techniques, such as ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing, may eventually reveal traces of their villages. Finding where they lived could show us what tools they used every day, how they built homes, and how they organized their society. Preservation techniques are also improving. Half of the pond was deliberately left untouched so that future generations could study it with better methods. Scientists today can use non-destructive imaging and microanalysis to examine tissue without damaging it. This means that the untouched half of Windover could one day reveal more brains, more DNA, and perhaps even evidence of diseases or conditions that affected people thousands of years ago. In this way, the site has been left as a gift for the future. For medical researchers, Windover also offers something extraordinary. Studying the preserved brains may help them understand how ancient diseases looked at the cellular level. It could provide clues about how human brains have evolved, or even how certain illnesses appeared or changed over time. In this sense, Windover connects not only to archaeology, but also to modern medicine and neuroscience. The Windover discovery reminds us that history is never complete. Entire lineages may have lived, flourished, and disappeared without leaving any trace in today's world. As research continues, Windover is forcing scientists to expand their understanding of human migration, population change, and the fragile legacy of DNA. The swamp still holds its silence, but the people of Windover are not forgotten. Their preserved brains and their mysterious DNA challenge us to keep searching, to keep questioning, and to look deeper into the earth for voices from the past. The future of archaeology may depend on listening to those whispers, still waiting in the mud. What do you think about the Windover discovery? Could these preserved brains belong to a lost lineage we may never fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments.